Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I am the host of Reformed GGA, and today I'm going to go over my shooting impressions of this little thing right here. This is the SIG P365XL, so slightly larger than the base model. And those of you who've been following the channel know that I purchased this a while ago, and I have not updated you guys on how it's shot yet, and the main reason why I didn't do that is because I don't have a whole lot of rounds through it. It came with 2 magazines, and I have fired those magazines fully loaded, a grand total of 2 times each for 48 rounds total. So the main reason why I haven't done an update video yet is just simply because I don't have a lot of rounds to the gun. Nonetheless, even though I don't have a lot of rounds to the gun, there are some initial impressions that I have from shooting it that you may find beneficial and useful. First thing to note is that this thing did not run flawlessly. This gun does seem to be a little bit ammo sensitive. I didn't test a whole lot of different kinds of ammunition, but I did test a few. I tested the normal Tula ammo. I tested some Wolf that was the copper-plated stuff. I did test some of the what is that called? The SIG Sauer V-Crown 124 grain. Tested that, and I may have also tested one other type. I'm not remembering. It's been a while back that I did that. But this thing did hiccup on the Wolf copper-plated stuff, and it wasn't a super bad malfunction. What happened is that it just failed to go into battery all the way, and so just gave it a little tap on the back and it went into battery, and after that it fired fine. But it still did not go into battery with one of the Wolf rounds. Also, the SIG Sauer 124 grain V-Crown, while it didn't malfunction on any of those, it was very, very, very tight on them. And just in loading and unloading that particular ammunition through the gun several times, because it's one of my favorite carry loads, the SIG really tore that ammunition up, and that's not uncommon with handguns. For a round that gets loaded and unloaded multiple times, it'll start to show some wear. For example, the forcing it in and out of the magazine will cause the sides of the casing to get scratched, and so you'll have these scratches that go lengthways down the cartridge. That's not uncommon. Sometimes the bullet tip itself will get kind of scratched and dinged up. That's not uncommon. The rim that is getting pulled out by the extractor multiple times, that will get a bit chewed up. So that's not uncommon. Another thing that will happen sometimes with defensive rounds that get loaded and unloaded several times is sometimes you'll get what is called bullet setback, where the projectile actually gets pushed into the casing more than it's designed to be, which can actually be dangerous in certain situations, cause an overpressure situation, depending on just how far back it gets set into the casing. And all of those happened with the SIG Sauer ammunition in this gun. And in addition to all those fairly normal things, it also developed concentric rings around the casing, which is usually a sign that it's not feeding smoothly. Instead, it's getting hung up and then kind of having to get hung up and stopped and kind of jerked around the different curve points of the gun. And this, while it's annoying, did not surprise me about the P365XL, because the normal P365 also is a little ammo sensitive. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad gun. It just means that there's certain kinds of ammunition that it doesn't like. And both the SIG Sauer 124 V-Crown and also that Wolf ammunition that I mentioned with that had copper, that was copper plated, both in the casing and the projectile. Both of those ammunitions are known for being kind of thick. They have a little bit greater diameter than other ammunitions do, and so they don't always tend to feed through things very well, which is really ironic given that it's a SIG gun and it doesn't like SIG ammo. But it is, from what I've seen with other P365s that I've had access to, it's basically par for the course for this gun. P365s in general do not seem to like those wider diameter cartridges. I don't tend to feed them as well, as reliably, and they can produce malfunctions. In my case, it was just simply not going into battery, remedied by a simple tap on the back. Sometimes the malfunctions can be a little bit more severe. But it is also worth pointing out that that was the only malfunction that I had in those 48 rounds. Granted, that's not a lot, and like I said, in the future I want to, put more rounds to it so I can give you guys a little bit more on the longevity of the gun. But within those first 48 rounds, we've determined that it is ammo sensitive, which is not unusual for the type for P365s in general, but it is something that people are going to want to be aware of. And aside from that, didn't really have any other issues. It's a nice little shooter. And for its size, I've got to say, not only does it have a fairly decent trigger, it's not perfect, but it has a fairly decent trigger. And on top of that, the recoil impulse is surprisingly good for the size. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't have recoil. I'm not saying that it's perfectly flat and smooth and just as good as a competition pistol that's been tuned to a specific load or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that relative to other guns in its same category in terms of size, it actually performs quite well. It is a relatively smooth and, by comparison, relatively light trigger for what it is, and I've noticed relatively little muzzle flip. That's not to say that there wasn't any. It's still a small gun shooting a fairly snappy cartridge, but it was a significantly smaller amount of muzzle flip than I've experienced with the regular P365 or the Hellcat that I used to have. Both of those had a pretty pronounced muzzle flip to them, and I think part of that just had to do, of course, with the fact that they're so small, only about 3-inch barrels, but also the recoil system in them is a little bit different than on this gun. And those ones, they had nested recoil springs and nested guide rods. There was basically an inner rod and an outer rod, and each of those rods both had their own spring. And I think that contributed to how snappy they felt and how much muzzle flip I got from them. This one, on the other hand, is just big enough that it has a conventional guide rod and spring. And so you don't wind up with that compounded effect, and instead it tends to shoot a little bit more flat. So I do greatly like that about it. After I got it zeroed, I was kind of, fiddling around with it in the first magazine to get it zeroed. So the first magazine, in terms of accuracy, I don't really count because I was still zeroing for that. But once I got it zeroed, after we got through the first magazine, it was very easy to keep on target. And granted, the target that I was using was not overly difficult. It was just a steel 8-inch plate at 25 yards. That's not a terribly hard standard to meet. But with this gun, with this little red dot, this is a Holosun 507K for those who are curious. But this gun with this red dot, I had no problems keeping the subsequent shots from all of the other magazines, aside from the first one when I was getting it zeroed. But all of the subsequent rounds, those 3 other magazines, kept them on the 8-inch plate at 25 yards with virtually no problem whatsoever. I didn't really do any thorough testing in terms of, transitions and those kinds of things, so I can't really report on that, but I can tell you that it was very easy to get those shots, very quick to get those shots, and like I said, by comparison to most other guns in its category, and even the P365 standard and the Hellcat OSP that I used to have, relatively little muzzle flip. Really good that way, and of course the trigger on these is fairly decent as well. This one, when I first got it, it was a little bit gritty. Most of that grit has worn out, but it is still a little on the stagey side. But when you're shooting it At least I don't notice that to be a major issue. Now granted, if I was a competitive shooter and, you know, going for like a bullseye competition or something like that where I wanted to get it the itty bitty tiniest group possible, yeah, the trigger would probably be an issue at that point. Or if I was doing basically a speed competition, you know, off goes the buzzer and I would want to get all my shots in just as quickly as possible. Yeah, I could start noticing some issues that way, but frankly, this thing is not meant to be a competition gun. Nobody thinks that this is going to be a great gun for bullseye competitions. No one thinks it's going to be a good race gun. It's not what it's designed for. It's designed to be something that is relatively easy to conceal carry, and at the same time, also relatively easy to shoot. You can actually, you know, accomplish something with it rather than, you know, just kind of firing wildly at the end hoping that you hit something kind of thing. You know, it definitely beats a Derringer. It beats most other of the little compacts that are out there. And I've got to say that in terms of how easy it is to shoot and how accurate you can be with it, it really does compete with a lot of my compact and even full-size handguns that I've dealt with. So I'm perfectly satisfied in that regard. Let's talk a little bit about some of the accessories here. I finally got the holster in for it. I'm not sure if I mentioned this on the last video, but that did come in, and this is just one of the Concealment Express holsters. They work pretty decently, not overly expensive. I think Concealment Express kind of changed their naming a little bit. I think they say that they are rounded now, like around. So it's rounded by Concealment Express. Not sure why they did that, but it's the same company making basically the same product. Like I said, usually relatively inexpensive. They're usually close to $40 to $50 for their Kydex holsters, and they work quite well. They fit quite well. Nice solid lockup. Very secure in terms of falling out. They also protect the trigger area quite well, so you can't get anything in there. Very pleased with the holsters that they produce. I will say that in loading this thing up to shoot it, I found out that the little loading tool that they give for the SIG P365XL really is nice to have when you're first loading the magazines, because they are definitely on the stiff side. That being said, I did find that if you left them loaded for a prolonged period of time, you know, say a week or two, that they did lessen up a little bit, and in my experience at least, as you go down the road, you won't need the loading tool nearly as much. It's still nice to have, of course, but in terms of being a necessity, after a while, the magazines do seem to break in, and you can load them manually if you need to. Like I said, the speed loader is nice, especially at the beginning, but the magazine springs do seem to break in after a while. So yeah, I know that's not a whole lot to go on. Like I said, only 48 rounds total. We did find that it is a little ammo sensitive, but P365s, basically regardless of the version, tend to be a little ammo sensitive anyways. I'm not greatly worried about that because I know that it's an issue. I know what causes it. You know, it's basically any round out there that has a little bit wider than normal diameter tends to get hung up in the P365s. That includes the SIG Sauer V-Crown ammunition. That includes the Wolf ammunition. With the copper plating, I think it would also probably be a bad idea to do the stuff that has the thick lacquer coating on it. Rounds like that are going to be a bit of an issue. Now, it is worth pointing out that my Hellcat never had that problem. It would feed basically just anything just fine. Terrible trigger pull, but you could put anything that you wanted in it in terms of ammunition, basically. Anything that was, you know, safe to fire was typically fine to fire. So I did like that about the Hellcat OSP. I just really hated the trigger on that one. The 365XL, on the other hand, it's more ammo sensitive. I knew that going into it, that was probably going to be an issue, and so, you know, just plan on having alternate types of ammunition available, you know, in case it winds up being fairly picky with the ones that I think it might be picky with, which wound up being the case. and you upgrade to a much better trigger, and in this case it's a little bit flatter shooting, not nearly as much muzzle flip. Like I said, it's still a small gun, so it's not like it doesn't have any, but it is less by comparison. Oh, one final thing that is worth mentioning here, and that is the controls. This is not the version with the safety, of course. With striker-fired guns, I prefer to let the holster be the safety, but it would be worth noting that the safety on the P365s tends to be pretty far back, which is a little bit hard to activate. And you also notice that if I were to activate the safety, that is not there, but if it was on a model that would, I would have to break my firing grip to operate the safety. And then on top of that, the bolt stop bolt release, I can get it, but it's just far enough outside of where my thumb is that it does wind up being a problem. So yes, I can lock the slide back, and yes, I can release the slide, but it is really not preferable. I wish that it was just a little bit further back. So the control placement on the gun is a little awkward in that regard. The magazine release is in a pretty decent spot. Now, the grip does give you enough of a grip to get a proper full firing grip on it in terms of having your pinky and whatnot, but your normal standard magazine is just recessed in there far enough. It's just short enough that really getting a good release and connection on the magazine requires me to break my grip just a little bit. If you got a slightly extended magazine, you probably wouldn't have that issue. I know there are some companies out there that make some very short extensions that'll give you like 2 more rounds, and most of them, well, I won't say most of them, but at least some of them are fairly low profile. You only extend it by like 1/4 of an inch max, maybe even closer to 1/8 of an inch with some of them. But yeah, if they had just a little bit larger foot on the magazine or just a little bit longer handle, it would be better that way. But again, within the design constraints of the handgun and what it's designed to be, like I said, it's not a competition gun, and it's not really a fighting gun. It is just self-defense, breaking contact kind of thing. Frankly, it's not really made with, stay and fight, going through multiple magazines in mind. It is nice that it does have a slightly beveled magwell, but like I said, it's not really a fighting gun. There's not any police force out there that is going to issue P365XLs to all of their officers, because for that kind of use, typically full-size, duty-size handguns are a better pick. It's not meant to replace those. It's its own thing with its own purpose. It's not meant to be used in the same way. But within all of those constraints, and like I said, acknowledging that it's going to be a little ammo sensitive, so far it looks pretty decent. Like I said, I definitely verified that it is ammo sensitive, but with that exception, it is perfectly adequate to the task. And like I said, it is actually very easy to keep on target. Granted, that's not a hard target. 8 inches at 25 yards is not, stellar accuracy, but it was easy enough that, like I said, it did compete with a lot of the full-size guns that I've dealt with in the past. So that's worth noting. Alright, that's all I got for you guys. Thank you very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know Him and to submit to Him, the only genuine Savior and King of humanity. Amen.